When it comes to American history, truth is usually stranger than fiction. But sometimes fiction is more interesting than truth. But it is always strange when people choose to believe the fiction without even trying to pursue the truth. Now, when it comes to the story of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, we were all lied to. And it's okay to finally admit it and to understand who lied to us and why. So, while you watch this video that I shot in January of 2025, I'm going to do just that. Before we get rolling, let me tell you that this does not affect my life in one way or the other. I really don't care. In fact, if Thomas Jefferson had some loving, respectful, wonderful, lasting romantic relationship with Sally Hemings and they had a bunch of kids together, I couldn't care less. But that's not what happened. You see, it all started off as a lie. And at the time, anyone with half a brain, especially everyone at Monticello, knew it was a lie. So here's the truth. The politically motivated rumor that Thomas Jefferson had a child with his slave, Sally Hemings, was first publicly introduced by a man named James Thomson Callender. He was a Scottish-born journalist and political pamphleteer, and he did this in September of 1802. Callender published the accusation in the Richmond Recorder, a Virginia newspaper claiming that Jefferson had maintained Sally Hemings as his concubine and fathered several children with her. This marked the beginning of the widespread dissemination of the rumor, though whispers about Jefferson and an enslaved woman had circulated earlier in Virginia society, though that sort of thing happened all the time, not just with Thomas Jefferson. Now, why would Callender do this? Well, his motivations were rooted in personal grievance and political opportunism. Initially an ally of Jefferson, he had supported the Jeffersonian Republicans by writing scathing attacks against Federalists, including the great John Adams, during the contentious 1800 presidential election. Jefferson, who won the presidency, had indirectly encouraged Callender's efforts through intermediaries. However, after the election, Callender sought a reward for his loyalty, specifically the position of postmaster of Richmond. When President Jefferson refused to grant him the appointment, Callender turned bitter and vengeful. And we all know how things go once that happens. By 1802, with President Jefferson in office, Callender, now aligned with Federalist critics, unleashed a series of attacks on the president. And so the Sally Hemings story was part of this broader campaign to discredit Jefferson morally and politically, exploiting racial and sexual taboos to inflame public opinion and damage his reputation ahead of future elections. Think about the timing. September 1802. That coincided with Jefferson's first term as president, a period of intense partisan rivalry between the Republicans and Federalists. Callender's article capitalized on existing gossip about the light-skinned enslaved children at Monticello, which some attributed to Jefferson or other Jefferson men, including his younger brother Randolph, who lived nearby and was known to socialize with enslaved people. Callender's decision to name Sally Hemings specifically and frame her as Jefferson's concubine gave the rumor a concrete form, amplifying its political impact. His aim was not just personal revenge, but also to serve Federalist interests by undermining Jefferson's image as a virtuous leader, a charge that resonated with critics, who saw hypocrisy in the author of, quote, "All men are created equal," end quote, owning slaves. And so Callender not only started the public rumor, but his publication transformed vague talk into a national scandal, driven by his spite and the political climate of the early 1800s. And, of course, you have a lot of people driven by spite in the political climate at the time of this recording. And so they, too, are more than happy to continue to push this narrative, including many who are at Monticello today. So now let's dive deeper into this. Now, chances are many of you never knew that Thomas Jefferson had a brother. So let's talk about him. Randolph Jefferson was Thomas Jefferson's only surviving full brother. He lived at Snowden, a plantation about 20 miles from Monticello, and he led a less prominent life than Thomas, marked by financial struggles and a reputation for being way less intellectual and certainly less disciplined. Randolph married twice, First to Anne Lewis in 1780, but she died in 1799, with whom he had several children, and then to Mitchie B. Pryor in 1809. Unlike Thomas, who never remarried after his wife Martha's death in 1782, Randolph's personal life was more tumultuous, and he was known to frequent taverns and socialize widely, including, reportedly, with enslaved people. But he wasn't the only male in the Jefferson family who was known to do so. In the 19th century, Thomas Jefferson's grandson, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, told Henry S. Randall, a historian at the time, that Sally Hemings' children were fathered by one of Jefferson's nephews, either Peter or Samuel Carr, sons of Jefferson's sister Martha. That's kind of an interesting revelation, isn't it? I mean, honestly, wouldn't Thomas Jefferson's grandson know if his grandfather was the father of Sally Hemings' children? Probably. Also, a 1998 DNA study confirmed a Jefferson male line connection to Sally Hemings' youngest son, Easton, but couldn't pinpoint Thomas specifically, since the Y chromosome haplotype is shared among male Jeffersons, including Randolph. Now, Randolph visited Monticello quite a bit, often staying for days and sometimes even weeks at a time, especially after his first wife's death, when he sought Thomas's help with financial troubles and his children's education. Now, check this out. Thomas Jefferson's meticulous records noted Randolph's presence at Monticello during periods that overlap with Sally Hemings' conceptions. That's kind of a coincidence, isn't it? Or maybe it's not. Isaac Granger, an enslaved blacksmith at Monticello who later gave an oral account in the 1840s, described Randolph as someone who, quote, used to come out among black people, play the fiddle, and dance half the night, end quote. And there's at least one testimony of someone else who lived at Monticello who used to see Randolph hanging around the cabin and leaving in the early mornings from where Sally Hemings lived. Hollywood films never cover that stuff, do they? Nope. Now let's talk about Jefferson in Paris. Hollywood films like to portray Sally Hemings as some beautiful woman who was a borderline genius with a heart of gold who Thomas Jefferson fell in love with or took advantage of. And there are countless ridiculous stories about how she and her brother found out that they were not considered to be slaves in France, and they had a big sit-down with Thomas Jefferson, where they confronted him, and they negotiated a deal where they would stay with him, but only if he met their demands. You think that happened? You think they went in there and threatened Thomas Jefferson and said what? They're going to abandon their entire family and friends back at Monticello and live the rest of their lives in a foreign country, where a bunch of, what? French aristocrats would piss off Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, John Adams, John Jay, and all other current and future American diplomats in order to give Sally and James a chance to escape from the grips of their master. Give me a break. There's no way in the world any of that ever happened. Here's the truth. Thomas Jefferson went to Paris in 1784 to serve as a commissioner and later as the U.S. minister to France, replacing Benjamin Franklin. When he arrived in Paris in August of 1784, Thomas Jefferson was 41 years old. Now, Sally Hemings' exact birth year is uncertain because enslaved people's birth certificates were rarely precise, but historians generally agree she was born in 1773, likely around May or June, based on family traditions and estate records from Monticello. This estimate also comes from the fact that her mother, Betty Hemings, was inherited by Thomas Jefferson and his wife Martha in 1774 after the death of Martha's father, John Wales, who is widely accepted as Sally's father. Sally was the youngest of Betty's 6 children with Wales, and her siblings' birth years helped narrow it down. So, if Sally Hemings was born in 1773, she would have turned 11 in May or June of 1784. Thomas Jefferson arrived in Paris on August 6, 1784. So at that time, Sally was still in Virginia and approximately 11 years old. So when Thomas Jefferson went to Paris, Sally was 11 years old. Keep that in mind. Now, she didn't travel to Paris until 1787, when she accompanied Jefferson's daughter, Maria, also known as Polly, at the age of about 14. Now, Thomas Jefferson requested that his daughter, Polly, be brought to him in Paris and that she be accompanied by an older woman who worked on the estate. He did not request Sally Hemings, who he last saw, if he ever really saw her at all, by the way, because Thomas Jefferson had a lot of slaves, I'll talk about that later, when she was 11 years old. You really think that Thomas Jefferson is hanging out in Paris and he's saying to himself, wow, if only I can get my 11-year-old female slave out here, that would really be something. Give me a break. French women loved brilliant men like Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. In fact, some French women still love brilliant men, or so I've heard. No doubt, Thomas spent a lot of time with many beautiful, educated, charming French ladies every chance he could. And Thomas Jefferson was a very busy man. And so he asked Abigail Adams if she would arrange to meet his daughter, Polly, and her chaperone, whoever that might be, when they arrived after their journey across the Atlantic. Now, as you likely know, Abigail Adams and Thomas Jefferson were very good friends. By all accounts, she was a brilliant woman who everyone respected. Abigail Adams met Sally Hemings in 1787 when Sally was 14 years old, and she and Polly arrived in London. Abigail and her husband, John Adams, were in London at the time, where John was serving as the U.S. Minister to Great Britain. Abigail took the two girls into her care for a few weeks, from June 26 to July 12th of 1787, before arranging their travel to Paris. Now here's where things get interesting. You ready? Abigail's impressions of Sally Hemings are documented in two letters she wrote to Thomas Jefferson during this period. In her letter of June 26, 1787, Abigail describes Sally as follows, quote, "The girl who is with Polly is quite a child, and Captain Ramsay is, of opinion, will be of so little service that he had better carry her back with him. But of this you will be a judge. She seems fond of the child and appears good-natured." End quote. 2 days later, on June 28th, she elaborated, quote, "The girl she has with her wants more care than the child, and is wholly incapable of looking properly after her without some superior to direct her." End quote. So, from these letters, it's clear that Abigail Adams viewed Sally as immature and unprepared for the responsibility of caring for Polly, who was about 9 years old at the time. Abigail's description of Sally as, quote, "quite a child," end quote, and, quote, "wanting more care than the child," end quote, suggests she saw her as young, inexperienced, and perhaps overwhelmed by the task. The phrase wholly incapable implies a lack of maturity or competence in Abigail's eyes, though she doesn't criticize Sally's character, only her readiness for the role. Abigail even suggested that Captain Ramsay, who had brought them across the Atlantic, might take Sally back to Virginia, though she deferred to Jefferson's judgment. And so, yeah, Abigail Adams did think Sally Hemings was immature, described her as a child, and questioned her ability to look after Polly properly. So based on all this, do you think this is the brilliant, warm-hearted, loving, sexy woman who would soon sweep the great Thomas Jefferson off of his feet and who he would risk his entire reputation over, as you were led to believe? If you are still not convinced, check this out. Sally Hemings is believed to have had at least 6 children, though some accounts suggest a possible earlier pregnancy, when she was about 16 or 17. Madison Hemings' memoir mentions a child born after Sally returned from France that lived but a short time. But no definitive record confirms this, and it's debated among historians. It's just a way for them to further slur Thomas Jefferson. So consider the following. Sally's daughter, Harriet, was born on October of 1795. Sally was 22. Thomas Jefferson was 52. Her daughter, Beverly, was born on April 1st of 1798. Sally was 24. Thomas was 54. Sally then had an unnamed daughter who was born on December 7th of 1799. Sally was 26. Thomas was 56. Sally then had another child that she named Harriet, who was born on May 22nd of 1801. Sally was either 27 or 28. Thomas Jefferson was 58. Now take note of the following. Between 1797 and 1801, Thomas Jefferson lived primarily in Philadelphia, and then moved to Washington, D.C. as vice president under John Adams. He was in Philadelphia from March of 1797 until the government relocated, then in D.C. from November 1800 to March 1801. He was there, as you can imagine, to preside over the Senate and engaging in political activities. He did return to Monticello during congressional recesses in the summers of 1797, 1798, and 1800. But other than that, there are no accounts of Thomas Jefferson getting in a horse-drawn carriage and going on an arduous journey from Philadelphia or Washington, D.C., all the way to Monticello simply to have a quickie with Sally Hemings, or anyone else for that matter. By the way, in the 1700s, travel between colonial cities was slow and arduous. For comparison, Benjamin Franklin's postal riders on horseback, not carriages, could cover 50 to 100 miles a day with fresh horses, but a carriage with passengers and luggage moved much more slowly. And so a horse-drawn carriage journey from Philadelphia to Monticello in the 1700s would likely have taken 9 to 14 days, with 11 days being a reasonable average, depending on weather, road conditions, and stops. This, of course, assumes no major disruptions like breakdowns or impassable rivers, which could extend the trip further. Now, I'm sure Sally was a lovely lady, but the idea that Thomas Jefferson traveled 11 days in a horse-drawn carriage from Philadelphia down to Monticello just to hook up with her seems kind of unrealistic. Sally then had a son named Madison, who was born on January 19th of 1805. At the time, Sally was 31, Thomas Jefferson was 61. Sally then had a son named Eston, who was born on May 21st of 1808. At the time, Sally was 35 years old, Thomas was 65. Now consider this. Between 1801 and 1809, Thomas Jefferson lived in Washington, D.C. as the third U.S. president. He resided in the President's House, now called the White House, in order to lead the nation, manage the Louisiana Purchase, and overseeing the Lewis and Clark expedition, among his many other duties. Sally Hemings did not work at the White House, nor did she ever even visit the White House. There's no historical evidence, such as Jefferson's detailed records, White House staff lists, or contemporary accounts, to suggest she ever lived or worked there. Sally Hemings remained at Monticello throughout his time in office, consistent with her role as an enslaved domestic worker in the household. Now let me ask you this. If she was this big love of his life or sexual plaything, as Hollywood keeps wanting to tell us, then why wasn't she there at the White House, where he could have easy access to her anytime he wanted? By the way, Sally Hemings' role at Monticello included sewing, tending to Jefferson's personal quarters, among others including Thomas Jefferson's family members. Thomas Jefferson's meticulous farm books and letters track Sally's presence at Monticello, where she gave birth to several children during his presidency. By the way, a lot of people lived at Monticello. At the time that Thomas Jefferson was there, he had family and friends and workers everywhere. And yet, the only person who ever said that he had a fling with one of his slaves was a guy who hated him, who owned a newspaper. And yet all these years later, people believe it to be true. So why have Hollywood and New York City publishers and a bunch of people who claim they are Jefferson historians continued to try to convince Americans that the great Thomas Jefferson decided to spend his emotional and sexual energy on just one of over 600 enslaved individuals that he was responsible for over the course of his lifetime? And why isn't there a single account anywhere at any time of Thomas Jefferson sharing his affections with any other females at Monticello? Especially after he died, because it's like, well, what have they got to lose, right? But nope, it's just one, just Sally Hemings. That's the best they got to go after that straight old white man. And so they've latched onto that, and they're just going to keep on beating that one into the ground. But just because they say it doesn't mean it's true. We ain't buying it. Well, if you agree that Thomas Jefferson never had a sexual relationship with Sally Hemings, and that Thomas's younger brother Randolph, or another Jefferson male, was instead the father of her children, the question of why people today might prefer to attribute paternity to Thomas is a fascinating one. So let's talk about those, because it touches on historical interpretation, cultural dynamics, and modern ideological motivations. For starters, one motivation could be a desire to complicate or dismantle the idolized image of America's founders. Thomas Jefferson, as the author of the Declaration of Independence and a symbol of Enlightenment ideals, occupies a near mythic status in American history. And so attributing paternity to him, especially in a relationship marked by power imbalance and enslavement, introduces a stark contradiction between his words, all men are created equal, and his actions. And so if Randolph, a lesser-known figure with no grand legacy, were the father, the story loses its punch. It doesn't puncture the same heroic balloon. And so the focus on Thomas reflects a conscious or maybe a subconscious wish to attack America itself. A second reason might be that pinning the paternity on Thomas amplifies the narrative of the systemic sins of slavery. And so it's less impactful if Randolph, a peripheral figure, is the father, because his actions don't carry the same weight of historical responsibility. And so for those pushing for racial accountability, believing that Thomas Jefferson was involved serves as a way to force acknowledgement of slavery's legacy in the nation's elite, rather than letting it rest with a less prominent person. A third reason is kind of simple. The story is juicier with Thomas Jefferson at the center. A president, philosopher, and widower entangled in a secret relationship with an enslaved teenage girl makes for a gripping drama. Think of all the books and movies and headlines that can be created from this. But Randolph, a struggling planter with a fiddle and no national stature, simply doesn't captivate the same way. Sorry, Randolph. And so people gravitate toward Thomas Jefferson as the father because it fits a narrative arc that's both scandalous and morally complex, appealing to our love of flawed heroes. But there is a fourth reason. Some critics of American exceptionalism, whether scholars, activists, or revisionists, prefer Thomas Jefferson as the father in order to undermine the moral authority of the nation's founding, by implicating a key architect of the Republic in a relationship that epitomizes exploitation. They can now argue that America's ideals were tainted from the start. This aligns with a broader skepticism of power structures, where knocking Jefferson off his perch serves as a proxy for critiquing systemic privilege or imperialism. And if Randolph were the father, well, the story stays a family footnote, not a national indictment, diluting its utility as a weapon against the establishment. The 1998 DNA study, which linked a Jefferson male line haplotype to Sally Hemings, shifted the debate heavily toward Thomas Jefferson because he was the most prominent Jefferson at Monticello. But there were other male Jeffersons there, weren't there? But once this narrative gained traction, backed by Madison Hemingway's memoir claiming Thomas as his father, it developed momentum. Now, people might cling to Thomas Jefferson as the father today, not out of malice, but because it's the prevailing theory, reinforced by self-proclaimed historians and institutions like the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, which was founded in the 1900s. Switching to Randolph requires rejecting this inertia, which some might resist simply because it's less familiar. And the sixth reason is political and cultural polarization. You see, in today's polarized climate, the Jefferson Hemings story has been weaponized. Simply put, there's lots of people at the time of this recording who simply hate the United States, and they take advantage of every chance they can to rip apart its heroes. And so these America haters embrace this mythical story in order to highlight racial injustice and patriarchal abuse, seeing Thomas's involvement as a way to critique historical power dynamics. The motivation to believe Thomas Jefferson was the father stems from a desire to score points in this culture war, either to tarnish a hero or to provoke debate about national identity. Randolph, as the father, sidesteps this clash, making it less appealing to those invested in this fight against the evil old white men. So what do you think? Is this all an anti-American scheme? Well, It might not necessarily be a coordinated scheme, but it does reflect an anti-establishment impulse for some. You see, tearing down Thomas Jefferson is a way to reject America and to challenge the hero worship that once dominated history books. That's why they want to tear his name off of buildings and tear down his statues and brainwash people into thinking this is the most horrible human being that ever lived, instead of as the brilliant hero that he actually was. And so denying Randolph as the father, or one of many fathers, and choosing instead to believe that it was Thomas Jefferson is also a way to keep the story relevant and provocative. So what do you think of the Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings story? Do you think, despite all that you know right now, that the great genius had a fling with Sally Hemings? Or do you think that you were lied to? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Kindly remember to like, share, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Please check out the links below to learn how to support my research and productions. Kindly be kind to all of our fellow Earthlings, and please do not harm them. And do yourself a favor and go to a local shelter and adopt a cat or a dog, or both. You and they will be very glad that you did. Until next time, I wish you safe travels on all your journeys.